So good evening, everybody, and thank you for that very kind introduction. And I hope I'm not too disappointing for everyone this evening. We had a Vincentian retreat recently for our province, and the retreat director was a Vincentian from the East Coast, and he began every conference with a joke. And he said, I had never heard the term before, but he said the idea was to soften us up. One of our staff people working at DePaul catches me when I go to the gym every day and tries to give me a new joke. And I'll tell you his joke from yesterday as I was crossing the path. How did Moses make his tea? Hebrew. Okay, so now I've softened you up. What I'd like to do as we begin is I'd like to just put you all to work, and I'd like you to take just a second, and I'd like you to think about what is your definition of the word of the term scientific literacy. So take just a moment and come up with just a very short definition of scientific literacy, since we're using that term. Okay, that's it. Now, I'd like you to turn to the person not beside you but behind you. So this row turns to that row turns to that row. And share with them your definition. And some of you may have to be a group of 3 instead of 2. And this will be on the test. Chris, what did your group say?
We appreciated the long time to ponder and working knowledge, understanding at least scientific knowledge so you can relate and understand, to evangelize, be able to see what is out there so you can relate and better minister.
All right. Thank Doris. What did you guys say?
What did we say? We said the ability to articulate, the ability to read an intelligent newspaper and understand what the articles about science were saying.
All right. Thank Katerina. Where are you?
Here I am. And you just had a wonderful exposition about undergraduate education, I presume undergraduate, and how much students need to know nowadays to become broad enough to engage in this tremendously complex society and to make good decisions. And he used a phrase that I won't use here, but a sister shouldn't use that phrase.
Oh. Well, we're all interested, maybe at the cocktail hour. But thank you for that. Before I move on, a couple of things I do want to say and begin with a very sincere thank you, first of all, to the John Templeton Foundation for the allowing us the resources to gather together and how supportive of they have been as a part of this project from the very beginning. I want to say publicly thank you to Doris and everyone who knows and has worked with her knows how much energy she has put into this, how much love, how much concern for the church, for the future of the clergy. It's been tremendous to feel that, and the fact that it's come to fruition and we are here. So I have seen that over the years, and I know personally how hard she has worked and what she has done. And also I want to say thank you to John Carroll University for all those who have supported this and helped bring this and supported Doris in all the work that she's done. And there's a lot of other people who have done that. But I wanted to make those 3 thank yous at the very beginning because I've seen and benefited from the hard work and the love and the concern that's come from that. And it's all about something we all care about, which is our future priests and the clergy that ministers to the church. So we gather as formators. So thank you to all of you for that. And finally, thank you to all of you for making the time to be here. Although coming to Tucson from Chicago and from the East Coast wasn't exactly a hard decision for many of us to make. But as Doris said, we began discussing Tucson as a possibility years ago, and we knew that it would be the right place to be for a number of reasons. So I'm going to make this real easy. I don't normally work with a text, but I do have a text, and I will work with it tonight because I don't want it to go so long. But my text was long, so I've been cutting things out, but I will use it. But I'm going to make it real easy that basically what I'm going to say tonight is just two things that probably we already know and that you've just been discussing. I want to talk about scientific literacy and what that can mean in the seminary formation environment. So I want to try and do that from my own experience and love for seminary formation. So I want to talk about what would that look like in a seminary? What is scientific literacy within that context? And then I want to talk about what that means for new evangelization and why is that connected to new evangelization. So those are the two things we're going to talk about. And the answers are, from my perspective, I'm going to define scientific literacy for seminarians simply as the desire for every seminarian to have a cordial relationship with science. That's what I would hope, that they would have a cordial relationship with science. We're going to spend a little bit more time looking at that. We're not going to try and turn every seminarian into a scientist. We're not going to inundate. The PPF doesn't have room for all of those things. But what is possible and what can make a difference is if our future clergy are there and they're not antagonistic or dismissive, the things that it's way beyond them or it's not important or all kinds of other reasons. So is there a cordial relationship, an openness to what they know and what they don't know, but just a cordial relationship, which I believe has been the tradition of the Catholic Church from the beginning, a cordial relationship with science. And then for the new evangelization, the simple answer is that we're dealing with an increasingly scientifically literate laity. And the people we minister to, and they're bringing those questions, and that's what's in their hearts. And if they're not being preached to and taught by people that have that cordial relationship, they're going to dismiss what they hear. And so, or they're not going to be given food that will truly feed the soul and answer the big questions that people bring. So those are the two things I'm going to talk about this evening. So those are the two major questions. I would begin with two pericopes from Scripture, one from Romans and the other from Luke, which I believe help get us started in pursuit of our answers. First one from Romans 1:20. Since the creation of the world, invisible realities, God's eternal power and divinity, have become visible, recognized through the things He has made. And Luke 4:16-19. I cheated a little bit with this because Vincent chose this as the motto for the Vincentians, Evangelizare pauperibus misit me. He came to Nazareth where he had been reared, and entering the synagogue on the Sabbath, as he was in the habit of doing, he stood up to do the reading. When the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, Jesus unrolled the scroll and found the passages where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Therefore He has anointed me. He has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor, to proclaim liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and release to prisoners, to announce a year of favor from the Lord." And so evangelization and scientific literacy. Perhaps no other two scripture passages can so succinctly and so clearly focus our attention on the purpose of this brief presentation, this conference, and most importantly, the project of re-engaging science in seminary formation. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, tells us that God can be recognized through the things He has made. This, in fact, articulates a wonderful mission statement for science also. A mission that has been taken up by countless Catholic women and men of science in pursuit of the truth that God has planted in what God has created. Luke intimates that the scientific mission could be an authentic part of the mission of Jesus. Creation is good. We bring the good news, which is the mission of God's church, to evangelize, to bring the good news to all God's people. So the connection between created reality, divine revelation, and the mission of the church to evangelize was understood, as most of us remember, by the church fathers and mothers. One example is found in the poetry appendix of the Liturgy of the Hours. Now, I know you're all familiar with your 4-volume Liturgy of the Hours, and I'm sorry to have to remind us all of this, something you all would know, but it's the very first poem in all 4 volumes in the appendix. And when you look at that, a poetry appendix at the back, you're reminded of this conference. It's right there. And it's called "The Beauty of Creation Bears Witness to God," and it's a poem by Joseph Mary Plunkett, who lived an Irish poet from 1887 to 1916. It's labeled in our Liturgy of the Hours as, it just simply says St. Augustine. It doesn't give the poet's name. But the poet took it from St. Augustine's Sermon 241, which he gave on Easter in 411. And the poem is beautiful, and I never tire of reading it or reading it to my classes when I teach biology or bioethics or theology. Question the beauty of the earth, the beauty of the sea, the beauty of the wide air around you, the beauty of the sky. Question the order of the stars, the sun whose brightness lights the days, the moon whose splendor softens the gloom of night. Question the living creatures that move in the waters, that roam upon the earth, that fly through the air, the spirit that lies hidden, the matter that is manifest, the visible things that are ruled, the invisible things that rule them. Question all these. They will answer you. Behold and see, we are beautiful. Their beauty is their confession of God. Who made these beautiful changing things, if not one who is beautiful and changeth not? I believe it might be to our advantage to first address the importance of scientific literacy. Perhaps we might begin by looking at a contemporary missionary and theologian who writes and is helpful. His name is Stephen Bevins, a Divine Word missionary and a professor of gospel and culture at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. He's long suggested in his almost classic text, Models of Contextual Theology, that all theology is contextual. This theme is certainly found in many official Catholic documents from Vatican II, and since, especially when context is understood as culture. The importance of attending to culture is something that Catholic missionaries have known for centuries, allowing evangelization to be effective in bringing the good news. I would suggest this evening that we need to understand science as a culture, and that it has its own language, it has its own method, and it's a way of understanding and of talking. And when we bring the good news as missionaries into cultures, as I did in Kenya and East Africa, and Bevins is talking about that, we need just as much to help our seminarians prepare for the scientific culture. That's the cordial relationship. And so it is learning a new language. It's about the context in which evangelization happens. So, whereas classical evangelization was often understood as bringing the gospel to the unbaptized, John Paul II has identified the new Areopagai, the baptized, as the focus of new evangelization. It's important, and an important and maybe neglected aspect of this new evangelization happens when the culture of science is acknowledged as part of the reality of people's everyday context. And so a familiarity with science and a cordial relationship with science is not only valuable, but fundamentally essential to the new evangelization. Another contemporary thinker, Thomas Friedman, may also be helpful to us. In some sense, Friedman, who's the author of The World is Flat, is correct. The world is flat, if you use his definition and his understanding. For he suggests that we're living in a world that has largely been globalized, and where that is not yet a reality, it's quickly becoming one. Now, while Friedman sees the forces that are flattening the world primarily as economic, it can just as easily be suggested that science is equally a part of the forces that are flattening our world and creating something of a universal culture that is shared by a growing number of the Earth's population. The biological and physical sciences are recognized as valuable and are studied in almost all the universities on the globe. Students of the physical and life sciences learn a language and live in a culture that cannot be ignored if we are to be effective at bringing the good news in word and sacrament into this new and quickly evolving context. Catholic populations that are growing in scientific literacy are asking more and more sophisticated questions about the relationship between the truths of their faith and the facts of science they are taught. So evangelization finds people where they are and takes them where Christ is. One simple example of the growing impact of science and technology throughout the world I will share is a personal experience as a missionary in Kenya when I was visiting one of our houses in a fairly remote part of East Africa in Tanzania. As I walked out in the pasture from our mission, I encountered a very rustic wooden corral filled with herds of cattle. The cattle, as I found out, were owned by Maasai herders and were brought to this place for auction. It was a colorful event way out in the forest. Nothing around except I stumbled on these herds of cows, this rustic corral, and these wonderfully beautiful Maasai warriors and herders in their brilliant red robes, their colorful beads, carrying spears and shafts. And as I approached, I was more than surprised when I saw these young men, these herders, in their traditional dress, and they reached into their robes and they pulled out cell phones. As I learned, these young men were calling their fathers, who were similarly in remote parts of Kenya, to carry on the negotiations that involved the sale of the cattle. It was for me a sign that the world of science and technology was affecting literally everyone on the globe. The world was flatter than I had thought. So what is scientific literacy and seminary formation programs? The term actually has been carefully coined and adopted. We talked about this for a long time regarding this particular conference and this particular project. And it has a meaning. It suggests that science as a kind of language should be something our seminarians are comfortable with and see through a Catholic lens. Scientific literacy is achieved when someone has a knowledge of science or acknowledges science as valuable. Scientific literacy is basically the ability to understand the scientific method and the logic of scientific exploration. It assumes a general notion of the history of science, the overall areas of scientific competence, and the limits of scientific truth. For the non-scientist, scientific literacy can be described as having a cordial relationship with science. It means having enough of a general notion of the value of scientific method and the historical development of science and the underlying subjects of mathematics and the physical and life science that one can read and understand the news about contemporary scientific projects. And I heard someone say about reading a newspaper article and I would heartily agree with that they can understand the news about contemporary scientific projects and approach science with both a healthy respect and a healthy skepticism. One does not achieve scientific literacy only by having an intimate knowledge of science. And I know we have some wonderful scientists in this group. And we're not all going to be that. And in seminaries, we're not going to do that to our seminarians. However, for them to know that there is a place in the church for these women and men of science, and there's a place in our theological preparation for priesthood for this kind of understanding and that cordial relationship again to have that. It should continue to be an emphasis and a focus. So scientific literacy in the seminaries may not just be a dedicated course. The worst thing from my perspective as a former dean and a seminary formator would be for us to simply say, oh, we've done our 2-unit course in pre-theology. We're done. Now we have scientifically literate men. And that's the tendency of every faculty that I have ever worked with, and not just seminary faculty. We slap a class on it. And I've seen bishops do this. We have a problem at the seminary. Let's have a class about spirituality. That'll make them holy. We have, they need to have more affective formation. We'll have a class in affective formation, as if all these classes do it. So I think the class is important, and as we all know, it begins the dialogue. But I would say that this idea of scientific literacy makes its way through the entire curriculum in the same way that hardly any of us here who are educators would not suggest that critical thinking. You don't know how many times I've gone to assessment workshops and trained seminaries and universities and about assessment and and they all raise their hand. Critical thinking. That's one of our goals. And I say, where is it? And how do you assess it? Oh, but it's important. So, but we could integrate this in so many classes, in so many ways. So I see that my former colleague, Father Luke Dysinger, is having his class on sexuality and marriage. He's using that as a way to do scientific literacy. He's seducing the students into becoming scientifically literate, whether they know it or not. So there's so many creative ways that can be done. It doesn't have to just be done that way. Of course, my own particular bent would be to have a class that the pre-theologians would learn some math, some biology, some physics, and get an introduction to all of these things. But I doubt that that's going to be happening. So all of us here are deeply invested in our Catholic faith. We are also deeply invested in seminary formation and making that formation even more effective. No doubt we've all been impressed by the wisdom of Pope John Paul II's Pastores Dabo Vobis. When that came out, Jerry bought copies of it for us and beat us on the head with it, made us sleep with it under our pillows, and it became a major. But Pastores Dabo Vobis is this fabulous directory in which we have placed before us the 4 pillars of formation. At one point, while academic dean at St. John's Seminary, a number of times, I heard some of our seminarians, I know this would never happen at your seminary, but it did happen at St. John's. Some of our seminarians made comments, or more accurately, wisecracks, about the seminary's formation program and its priorities. Having been made very familiar, our seminarians, with the 4-pillar model of formation used in Pastores Dabo Vobis, it was not unusual to hear them say, there are not 4 pillars here at St. John's. We've got 1 pillar, by which they meant the academic pillar, and 3 toothpicks. All right. So you're taking all of our time for prayer. You're taking all of our time for all of these human formation and pastoral, and you're making us go to the classroom all this time. So that is not an uncommon vision held by seminarians. I bring that up because this is the reality of the context in which, where in the PPF do we find a course in scientific literacy? And when you go back and you say, 1 more course, they're asking us to put in more courses. So be prepared. So what's the answer? We need to have a cogent answer to this. Where does it fit in? And are we not just adding to this already overstuffed curriculum in some ways? Can we hear our students crying about the toothpick pillars when confronted with a new required course? Yet here we are, gathered in a conference that begins a wonderful project of adding another new course, possibly, at least a new emphasis to the seminary curriculum. A focus that, while it is certainly hinted at in the Church's documents on priestly formation, certainly can't be found explicitly in the PPF. Well, here's my response. I would suggest that one starting point could be St. Anselm's definition of theology, fides, quaerens, and electum. This statement could reasonably sum up the telos of priestly formation simply because Anselm uses the gerundive. It is an ongoing. It's not just something that happens once. It is that ongoing search for understanding. And it happens in the understanding none of us should ever stop growing as human beings. So human formation is not something that's just done once. Intellectual formation, how many of us have heard our ordinaries challenge us and challenge the clergy to continue to be lifelong learners? And we bring that back to the seminarians. So the intellectual pillar is a lifelong. And spirituality. Spirituality never stops, never slows down. In fact, it should speed up as we move into our wisdom years. And so all of those, and our pastoral ministry should become more effective as we become more wise. So all of these things work together to support what we are talking about. And as Pastori Dobos Vobis tells us in number 16, in this way, priests like apostles act as ambassadors for Christ. This is the basis of the missionary character. So what Pastores Dobos Vobis says is the answer is that all of these pillars are for one purpose, evangelization. It's what the church is about. It's a missionary church. It brings the good news. And so this conference is based on the belief in the gospel message of Jesus Christ and the absolute importance of bringing that message to a world that is in such desperate need of hearing it. We also believe that in the contemporary world, scientific literacy is not just a luxury to be enjoyed by a few priests, but an essential element indeed needed by all clergy to be truly effective ministers of the good news to people who are asking the big questions about God and the universe, and who deserve a cogent reply that is in concert with the gospel and solid science, since, as Pope John Paul II reminded us in Fides and Ratio, that there is no contradiction between the truths of divine revelation and the truths uncovered by reason and science, for truth is one. Therefore, I would like to suggest that the Catholic vision of intellectual inquiry was compatible with scientific inquiry of the life and physical sciences for much of its history. And my personal perspective is that as we develop through this, what happened to this cogent relationship? Well, there are a couple of different moments. Alistair MacIntyre suggests that the moment of division happened actually at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and it happened first within liberal Protestantism, and it happened with evangelical Protestantism as a backlash to liberal Protestantism, and he suggests that we see that in the Scopes trial. And at that moment, you see the development of fundamentalism coming in at that moment. I would suggest that within the Catholic community, it may have actually happened earlier after the Reformation and in the Tridentine Reformation, the Catholic Reformation. What you begin to see is the development of seminary formation moving out of the universities into seminaries, and seminaries now using manuals. And so in the manualist tradition, what began to happen is the curriculum becomes much smaller than the university curriculum. And so the natural theology that would have been part of every Catholic priest formation and a part of the general education at Catholic universities is lost. And natural theology is where that cordial relationship with science was encouraged and felt. And so as we moved through and we began to use that manualist theology, it's not that anyone threw science out, there just was no room for it. And it began to get lost. And it maintained itself in the university tradition, so our laity and some of our educated clergy picked it up, and it kept it alive, but it wasn't a part of the ministerial preparation program. I would also suggest that perhaps your experience, those of us who have worked in seminaries, it could be the same as mine. I encountered a kind of evangelical Catholicism in which some of our students were actually borrowing some of their theology from what Alistair MacIntyre described as Protestant, the evangelical experience. And so you actually encounter seminarians who are not grounded in the beautiful tradition of a cordial relationship with science, but have adopted that sense that Christianity has to be absolutely countercultural. And I would suggest that the term countercultural also has a wonderful place in our church and a long tradition, but that when it is a victim of reduction and extrapolation, then what it does is it builds walls around us. And so therefore the mark of being a good Catholic is to adopt some of the stances of our fundamentalist brothers and sisters. And so you start to see that that's why creating this cordial relationship with science helps us truly own our Catholic identity and helps bring that Catholic identity back. And it helps us understand that if Pope John Paul II can say that evolution is more than a fact, more than a theory, what does that mean to our seminarians, and how do they invite that into dialogue within themselves? Because that would not be necessarily where some of them are coming from. So it can be argued that there was an unfortunate divorce between the previously comfortable and compatible marriage of natural philosophy and theology somewhere during the Counter-Reformation and the first development of the Catholic seminary curriculum, apart from the traditional ecclesiastical faculties found in the Catholic universities that before Trent served as the exclusive centers of Catholic theological training. Perhaps in response to some reformers' focus on sola scriptura, Catholic theological training and priestly formation began to use almost exclusively the new manuals that were presenting philosophy and theology in a more digestive form that rarely included any natural philosophy. So perhaps the greatest attestation to what can happen when scientific literacy is neglected in clerical formation is the Galileo affair, for which the Church made a public apology. However, it should be remembered that the love of the second book of Revelation, creation, was never entirely lost or abandoned by the Church. Just as the Galileo affair can be pointed to by some, the larger picture includes the significant contribution of natural philosophy, the early studies of mathematics, physics, and astronomy, and the later stories of innumerable Catholic women and men of science, including that of the simple Augustinian monk Gregor Mendel, where it is clear that the fire of empirical inquiry and the love of the life and physical sciences was still burning in the Church. I won't go at length about this, but Doris has put together at the website just a wonderful, wonderful array of the women and men of science in the Church and the history and tradition of the Church that helps people see visually all of those who have contributed to this cordial relationship over the years. Basically, the Church's documents on seminary formation, training, and intellectual formation since Vatican II, as found in Optatum Totius 65, the Vatican II document, Ratio Fundamentalis Institutionis Sacerdotalis from 1985, Pastoris Dabo Vobis, 1992, and the Program of Priestly Formation, 5th edition, strongly suggest that it is time to recover and reintegrate the tradition of teaching scientific literacy in the seminary's intellectual formation program. 1. The ministry of shepherd entrusted to the Church's priests demands that those shepherds have the intellectual capacity to engage the people of God in the modern world, which is undoubtedly a world of science and technology. 2, a seminary curriculum that does not ensure some degree of scientific literacy, defined as a cordial relationship with science, limits the ability to communicate, and when the ability to communicate is limited, the ability to evangelize, the heart of priests and the Church's mission is limited. 3, in 1965, Optatum Totius said that seminaries should be equipped with scientific training and that they should be, quote, conversant with recent scientific progress. 1965, Optatum Totius. 4, Pastoris Dabo Bova says that, quote, the challenge of the new evangelization shows just how important this intellectual formation is. The present situation is heavily marked by fresh problems and questions brought up by scientific and technological discoveries. It strongly demands a high level of intellectual formation, such as will enable priests to proclaim in a context like this the changeless, and I was very happy that they used my language in there. The context like this, the changeless gospel of Christ, and to make it credible to the legitimate demands of human reason. 5, Pastoris Dabo Vobis goes on to say, quote, in the precise field of the positive or descriptive sciences, these can help the future priest prolong the living contemporaneousness of Christ. They like to make up words in Rome, I guess. But it's a great word, contemporaneousness. And so can we make, using this context, we realize that this is a culture. Science is a culture. And if we're going to have contextual theology, if we're going to be missionaries, that is a place we need to be. Paul VI once said, quote, "Christ became the contemporary of some people and spoke their language. Our faithfulness to him demands that this contemporaneousness should be maintained." It is then clear enough that the reintegration of the empirical sciences into the seminary curriculum with a goal of a minimum threshold of scientific literacy for every future priest is not something new that the post-Vatican II Church is reaching for, but a recovery of a part of the best of the Church's theological and spiritual traditions that has been largely neglected for 4 centuries. However, it is clear from a careful reading of the Church's teachings about seminary formation that the Church does desire scientific literacy to be an integral part of contemporary priestly formation programs. And I have about 7 more pages, but I think that that was my first spot of conclusion. Amen.
Amen.